fundamentalism and its rejection of the new Organon. Matthew.
Thank you so much, Robin. Just before I give my paper, and I hope I stay to 20, keep it to 20 minutes, I just want to acknowledge a few people who aren't here today. Father Peter Beer and Father Tom Daly, my academic supervisors. Peter supervised my masters. Peter introduced me to Lonergan in the third term of 1987. So as I tell my students nowadays, when I did my theology last millennium, literally, Peter supervised my masters, Tom supervised my doctorate, and they were and are great mentors. And of course, Dr. John Beer, who sponsored the John Charles Beer Travelling Fellowship, now known as the Peter Faber Fellowship, of which Jeff Brodie is a most worthy recipient. I certainly owe my career to Father Peter, Father Tom, and to Dr. John. For my sins and for the punishment of what they did in a previous life for my students, I'm teaching at Notre Dame. I've been there for 13 years. And I find myself applying Lonergan to a lot of things. Teaching theology in general, topics like faith and science, even religion and terrorism, which has been a field of mine for some time, faith and culture. Even with one of the things I do as a community service is venomous snake catching, which everyone thinks is quite funny. But when I catch snakes, I'm always thinking of Lonergan's emphasis on what is real rather than what is assumed to be. So it's not quite conceptualism and intellectualism, but there's an analogy there. People have their preconceived ideas of what knowing is. People have their preconceived ideas of what catching a snake is. And I can assure you that just as Lonergan was firmly focused on what knowing really is, when you're catching a West Australian tiger snake, you want to know what really is. I'm also very involved in politics. I won't say anything political other than to say, during a recent meeting, someone asked, what's truth? The Pilate's question. And I just said, truth is that which stands up to persistent questions, which you'd all recognise as a direct quote from Father Tom Daly. And all these political junkies were, wow, that's wise. That's great. I'm just Lonergan. So I've been applying Bernard Lonergan to biblical fundamentalism. Not that Lonergan's a fundamentalist, quite the opposite, but fundamentalism is a movement that is very badly misunderstood. People assume that it's biblical literalism, which it isn't. That it's evangelicalism. It's not. So I'm dissenting from papal teaching there. The Pope and Father Spadaro said it was evangelicalism. They're kind of right, but also kind of wrong. People have all these misconceptions about it. But what I find very, very helpful, and I'm writing a manuscript on this, is that Lonergan's work in pursuing a new Organon helps clarify the very foundations of biblical fundamentalism. And it allows us to better understand the movement and its beliefs. Not in the sense that they applied a new Organon to theology, but quite the opposite. So what Lonergan did positively, they did oppositely and negatively. So we know that Lonergan was quite fond of the quote from Pope Leo XIII in Aeterni Patris, to enlarge and perfect the old by means of the new. Now, the new in Lonergan's work included a new Organon, a recovered and renewed method in theology. Now, the new Organon is an instrument of the mind, rather than, I just love this phrase, an instrument of the mind rather than an instrument of the hand. What Lonergan was doing was developing, as we know, a system of thought and a complete restructure of theology based on the invariant operations of the human mind. And to that end, Lonergan's insight and method in theology rested upon a self-appropriation of one's intellectual operations. So how does that help us understand biblical fundamentalism? Well, like Lonergan and Pope Leo XIII, fundamentalism emerged from a time when the new was challenging the old. But instead of using the new to augment and enlarge the old, fundamentalists chose to reject and even repress the new. In a way that was opposite to what would be Lonergan's work, fundamentalism went beyond theological conclusions, beyond this or that doctrine, and went deeper into the operations of the human mind. And this is something that, I mean, look, obviously I disagree with fundamentalists on a whole range of issues, but I respect them greatly, because a lot of people out there think that fundamentalism is incredibly shallow, but there's a great depth to it. If we understand Lonergan, we can understand the depth of fundamentalism. Lonergan affirmed and understood what we do when we know. Fundamentalism went just as deep, but it rejected the validity and the value of human nature and human thinking. And I think that's very important. As I'll say in this paper, fundamentalism embraced common sense knowing and a form of naive realism. It advanced the position that people know what Lonergan called the already out there now and real. And very importantly, it rejected subjectivity because it rejected the human subject. I'll expand on that now. But firstly, I mentioned that fundamentalism rejected the human subject. The reason it did that was their theological misanthropy. There's this dislike of human nature. Fundamentalists really exaggerate John Calvin. If you've ever read Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, and I remember once reading it to my wife, because my wife always corrects me, and she's right. But I said something about theological depravity, and she's like, what? Calvin, the nature of man is absolutely damnable and corrupt, with only evil coming from the nature of man. And she said, well, that's absolutely right, because then there's the nature of woman. And I said, that's not what Calvin was meaning. She said, that's what Calvin should have said. But, Calvin actually said that in the Institutes. And I would like to think that Calvin was writing rhetorically, not literalistically, but fundamentalism takes that to an extreme. If you read fundamentalist literature, it speaks of humanity, and in this way they're more inclusive than Calvin, women and men being depraved, corrupt, and unreliable. The way I put it is that fundamentalists have a strong faith in God, but no faith in human nature. And this is what separates them from evangelicals. In the 19th century, evangelicals also believed in human corruption. The good Calvinists or people who'd learned from Calvin. But they balanced their belief in corruption with a positive emphasis on our need for salvation, and they believed that people had the potential to come to the truth of Christ. However, after the experience of betrayal by Darwin, by higher criticism, and other movements, fundamentalists simply lost their faith in humanity. They turned from positively emphasising the need for the grace of Christ to negatively emphasising the damnation and corruption of depraved humanity. They came to believe that human nature is utterly depraved and that human reason can only act contrary to the Word of God. Just a word of warning to those who might be researching this. don't get on the university computer and do a search for depravity. You then have to explain to the IT people that you were looking up Protestants. Doesn't work. In the fundamentals, and I think that at least once in our life we should get a copy of the 4-volume fundamentals that were I was going to say the Bible of early fundamentalists. Not quite, but an authoritative set of books that really reveal what's at the heart of the movement. Crosby writes that because human nature is depraved, philosophy is, and I quote, a vain deceit. And through that, and I'll quote again, the evil principle is ever at work. So this isn't just saying that human nature is flawed or ambivalent, but it's depraved. Our thinking is a vain deceit. And who works through that? The evil principle. A fellow named Sidenstricker also writes in the Fundamentals that human nature is bound to, and I'll quote again, an inherent unrighteousness and an innate corruption that has affected every fibre and faculty of the human soul. As the great fundamentalist author Warfield puts the point, depraved human nature deforms the very image of God. That's a long way from subjectivity and objectivity being the fruit of human subjectivity when it's authentic. So belief in our absolute depravity led to fundamentalism's resolution rejection of subjectivity and human knowing. So the way that they wrote off the Enlightenment, the way that they wrote off Kant and everyone after him, was not really because of this or that philosophy, but a rejection of the goodness of human nature. The result of that rejection of the subject and subjectivity meant that fundamentalists then and now are the polar opposite of what Lonergan would promote. And in fact, and this is where it gets, I don't have time to do this now, but there's so many unnerving parallels with Catholicism that people don't want to hear that we're similar, but we are. But one of them is that fundamentalists are like the Catholics Lonergan speaks about, who treat truth as being, and I quote, so objective as to get along without minds. This is crucial for fundamentalisms. Fundamentalism is like, the X-Files. Yeah, so we remember the X-Files. Where is the truth? Truth is out there. Whereas we know the truth is in here. For the fundamentalists, the truth is definitely out there. And we can't know it because we're depraved. So they rejected the philosophical values of the Enlightenment and tied themselves to the objectivity that was emphasised in 19th century Anglo-American philosophy. They thought that truth was out there now, real. They didn't use those words, but those words of Lonergan describe it accurately. And they knew this truth when they could through naive realism, a one-step apprehension of truth, rather than truth that's gained through a critical and structured process of cognition, through experience, understanding, and judgment. So what is known by fundamentalists, and this applies to the classic fundamentalists of the late 19th, early 20th century, and the fundamentalists of today? Lonergan explains it perfectly. The already out there now real. George Marsden, who's probably one of the best scholars on fundamentalism I've read, noted that the Princeton scholars conceived of truth as an object to be apprehended in the external world. Truth is out there. Truth was not subject to a person's mental activity. There's no subjectivity, it's purely objective. So they thought of scientific reality, not just biblical reality, but scientific reality, as what was there to be seen and perceptible to an open-minded observer. That's one reason why they rejected Darwin. The conclusions of Darwin and natural selection, and how much time have I got?
We've got
So,
6 minutes.
okay. Asked me about my tangle with evolutionists. But they didn't just reject Darwin because of his conclusions, but they rejected the very methods there. Natural selection is not something that you can perceive. You can't look at natural selection. You can't look at a bunch of bones or something and deduce A came from B, came from C. It requires a theoretical understanding and a conception of something that cannot be seen. So this scientific naive realism also applies to the Bible. The Bible's supposed to be read with a simple faith-filled look at what is there and not seeing what is not to be there. That's why Spurgeon said that the Bible is read just as well by cottage dames, as he called them, in the language of the time, as by savants, also using the language of the time. So fundamentalism's philosophy, and I do call it a philosophy, is an example of what Lonergan calls naive realism. It doesn't distinguish understanding and judgment. For the fundamentalist, all one does in knowing is to take a look. I mentioned that this applies to the Bible as well as natural science. And Warfield, again, he's one of the best authors in that tradition, says that with regard to the Bible, the Christian's expected to take it all in without question as to its statements of fact. Marsden makes the point that fundamentalism's belief in inerrancy, which is a core belief, could only have emerged from what we call a naive realism. There's so much more I could say about the topic, and I'll spare you at the moment. I'm working on a lengthy manuscript I hope to finish sometime this year. But fundamentalism is not about this or that understanding of the Bible. It can be better understood as a movement which is the opposite to the new Organon on which Lonergan worked. Lonergan pursued an instrument of the mind. Fundamentalism rejected the mind itself, holding that human nature is depraved. Lonergan's new Organon sought a system of thought based on the invariant operations of the human mind, which affirmed the role of human subjectivity. Fundamentalism rejected subjectivity, rejected the goodness and usefulness of the mind's operation. Lonergan advanced, argued for, and explained human self-appropriation. The misanthropy of fundamentalism results not in self-appropriation, but rejection of the self. I think in the case of fundamentalism, we should recall Lonergan's point that there's no such thing as no philosophy. There is, when a religion deprecates the use of philosophy, as Lonergan says, the result inevitably is not no philosophy, but unconscious philosophy, and only too easily bad philosophy. And I think fundamentalism is either unconscious philosophy, although sometimes they do make philosophical arguments, so I hate to say it, but it's bad philosophy. We can understand fundamentalism thus a lot better in relation to Lonergan's new Organon. It's not just a matter of people taking the Bible literally, it's a movement of bad philosophy, and look, I'll say it, sometimes intentionally bad philosophy. This does a number of things. One of them is to distinguish fundamentalism from evangelicalism. And we understand it as a movement of common sense, naive realism that rejects human subjectivity. And whether it considers natural science or the Bible, it's restricted to the already out there now real. Thank you all so much for your attention.